Daniel Parker and his wife Melissa thought Willow Ridge would be their forever home, but within months, the very HOA they trusted began a relentless campaign to take their property, turning neighbors into strangers, rules into weapons, and their dream into a siege they never saw coming. When the Parker family first arrived at Willow Ridge, it felt like stepping into a picture-perfect postcard. The air was crisp with the scent of freshly cut grass, and every lawn seemed manicured to an exact standard. The houses, though varied in style, all followed a subtle color palette that gave the neighborhood a polished and unified look. They had moved from a noisy, cramped apartment in the city, and the contrast was overwhelming in the best way possible. For the first time in years, they could imagine their children riding bikes without worrying about traffic or strangers lurking in the shadows. The streets here curved gently around small parks, with flowering trees that framed each corner like something out of a painting. It was the sort of place where you could leave your windows open on summer evenings and hear nothing but crickets. The house itself seemed like a reward for all their years of hard work. It sat on a corner lot, which gave them more space than most homes on the block. The front porch wrapped around the side, offering the perfect spot for morning coffee or quiet reading. From the first moment they stepped inside, they noticed how the sunlight spilled through the windows in long golden streaks, warming every room. The kitchen looked out onto the backyard, and in that space, they immediately pictured something special: a small garden with tomatoes, herbs, and bright flowers where their kids could help plant seeds in spring. The moving process was exhausting, but every box they unpacked felt like another step toward a fresh start. Neighbors introduced themselves with cheerful waves and polite smiles, though no one lingered for more than a few minutes. It was the sort of politeness that felt welcoming yet distant, as if everyone had an invisible boundary line they didn't want crossed. Still, the Parkers were grateful for the civility. After years of loud city living, quiet distance seemed like a blessing. The Homeowners Association had been mentioned briefly in the closing paperwork, but the details were buried among dozens of other forms. It was described as a community organization that ensured property values stayed high and that everyone followed reasonable guidelines to maintain the neighborhood's beauty. There was nothing in the language that felt restrictive or threatening, and the Parkers saw it as just another part of living in a nice area. They even found themselves admiring the way the HOA kept things so clean. Flower beds by the entrances to the neighborhood were weed-free, and seasonal banners were hung along the main road. It wasn't until they'd settled in that the sense of comfort began to deepen. The children's laughter filled the backyard each afternoon, and the family's routines found a natural rhythm. Saturday mornings were for trips to the local farmers market, Sunday afternoons for walks along the neighborhood trails. The small garden in the back began to take shape sooner than expected. They bought soil, seeds, and a few small fruit trees, carefully mapping out where each plant would go. It felt like building not just a home, but a life they could be proud of. Friends from their old neighborhood visited one weekend, and the Parkers proudly showed off their new surroundings. Everyone agreed it was the sort of place that seemed impossible to find any more safe, peaceful, and full of potential. Even the slight reserve of the neighbors didn't seem like a flaw. The family assumed that, in time, friendships would grow naturally. For now, they were content with the feeling of safety, the slow pace of life, and the knowledge that their children had room to breathe. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, the Parkers would sit together on the porch and watch the quiet street. It felt like they had finally escaped the chaos they'd once thought was unavoidable. Every moment reinforced the belief that they had made the right decision. The house was more than a building. It was the beginning of a chapter they hoped would be long and full of good memories. They had no way of knowing that just beyond the calm surface, something else was already watching, something that had its own plans for their home and for their family. One warm afternoon in late July, a white envelope appeared in the Parkers' mailbox. It looked official, the return address neatly printed with the name of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. At first, it didn't raise any alarm. The family assumed it was a simple newsletter or maybe an announcement about a community event. Inside was a letter printed on thick paper, informing them that their backyard garden was in violation of landscaping uniformity standards. The wording was formal and impersonal, but the message was clear. They were being told to remove what they had worked so hard to build. The Parkers read it twice, searching for the exact rule they had broken, but none of the documents they had received during the home purchase mentioned anything about gardens being prohibited. At first, they brushed it off as a misunderstanding. Perhaps someone had filed the wrong paperwork or sent the notice to the wrong address. But within a week, a second envelope arrived. This one carried a fine for improper trash bin placement, stating that their bins had been visible from the street for too long after pickup. The Parkers began to feel a small ripple of unease. They had been careful to follow the rules, placing the bins out the night before and returning them promptly after the collection truck passed. Still, they paid the fine without protest, thinking it was easier to resolve the matter quickly. It didn't end there. Soon, the letters began arriving regularly, each one listing a new and oddly specific violation: a small chip in the paint on their porch railing, a hose not properly coiled, even a wind chime deemed incompatible with neighborhood noise standards. Each came with its own fine, and each was worded as though they were repeat offenders. The tone felt more like an accusation than a request for compliance. The Parkers started noticing small changes around them. A car they didn't recognize would park across the street for long periods, its occupant occasionally raising a phone or camera toward their property. A man on a morning jog seemed to slow down whenever he passed their house, eyes scanning the yard with unusual interest. It was subtle, but it was enough to make them feel watched. Whispers started in the neighborhood at the mailbox, near the park, and quick exchanges between neighbors who didn't realize they were within earshot. Someone mentioned that their lot was in a prime location, and that certain people had been looking at it for a while. The words didn't mean much at first, but the repetition made them impossible to ignore. Then came a letter unlike the others. It wasn't a violation notice. It was an offer. The HOA proposed to purchase the Parker property for what they described as a fair market value, promising a smooth process and quick payment. The message was framed as a friendly opportunity, but between the lines, it felt like something else entirely, more of a warning than an invitation. The closing sentence stood out: "This may be the simplest way to avoid further complications." The family didn't respond, but the pressure began to mount. More fines arrived, along with subtle but unnerving changes in how they were treated. The once polite neighbors no longer waved. Some turned away entirely, while others watched with an expression that was hard to read. The HOA office refused to meet in person, instead sending formal notices by mail that grew increasingly urgent. The garden, which had been their pride and joy, became a source of anxiety. Every morning, they checked to see if anything had been disturbed. Every evening, they scanned the streets for unfamiliar cars. The neighborhood that had once seemed peaceful was now layered with a tension they couldn't quite explain. They didn't yet know the depth of the plan unfolding around them, but they were starting to understand that the letters and fines were not random. They were the beginning of something deliberate, something aimed directly at forcing them out. The pattern became impossible to ignore. A dark sedan began appearing at odd hours, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes idling a few houses down. Its windows were tinted, but the faint glow of a phone screen was often visible inside. On more than one occasion, the Parkers spotted a camera lens pointed toward their property. Once, early in the morning, they saw a man crouched near the curb, measuring the distance from their fence to the road with a long metal tape. When they stepped outside, he quickly gathered his things and walked away without a word. Soon, flyers began appearing on their front door. Some were printed on official HOA letterhead, citing vague community compliance concerns and warning of escalating consequences for continued noncompliance. Others were anonymous slips of paper with messages like, "Sell now, before it gets worse," or, "You're bringing down the neighborhood." There was no signature, no indication of who had left them. The phone calls started next. At first, they came during the day. The line would click, followed by silence, then the call would disconnect. But soon, they began arriving in the middle of the night. Sometimes the caller would breathe heavily for a few seconds before hanging up. Other times, there would be faint background noises, a car engine idling, muffled voices, the distant bark of a dog as though the caller was outside. The family stopped answering unknown numbers, but the calls kept coming. The HOA itself remained distant, communicating only through the now familiar stream of letters. The fines increased, and the accusations became more absurd. One notice claimed that the shade of white on their window trim was non-compliant with approved pallet standards. Another accused them of improper seasonal decoration storage, even though they hadn't displayed any decorations. The language in the notices had shifted from polite requests to direct threats, warning of legal action and property liens. The breaking point came with a certified letter that required a signature. Inside was a single-page document labeled Final Resolution Proposal. The HOA, in partnership with an unnamed development company, was offering to purchase their home for what they claimed was above market value. But the language made it clear that refusal would lead to necessary enforcement measures to secure the property for future community benefit. It was no longer a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. The Parkers began to suspect that this wasn't about rule enforcement at all. They had overheard enough whispers to know that developers had been eyeing certain lots for years. Their corner property, with its extra space and visibility from the main road, would be ideal for a new community feature. And if the HOA was working with those developers, the harassment suddenly made perfect sense. Even so, the family refused to give in. They documented every notice, every fine, every strange occurrence. They installed security cameras around the property, hoping to capture evidence of the harassment. Within a week, the cameras recorded figures moving around their yard at night, men in dark clothing, faces obscured, walking along the fence line. On one occasion, a figure paused at the garden, bending down to inspect the plants before disappearing into the darkness. The isolation grew heavier. Friends from the neighborhood stopped visiting, and some even crossed the street to avoid walking past their home. At community events, the Parkers could feel eyes on them, conversations halting whenever they came within earshot. The unspoken message was clear: they were no longer welcome. The pressure was working exactly as intended. The HOA's tactics were growing bolder, and the sense of safety that had once defined Willow Ridge was gone. The Parkers knew they were being pushed toward a breaking point, and the question was no longer whether the HOA wanted them gone, it was how far they were willing to go to make it happen. Digging for answers became an obsession. Every spare moment, the Parkers searched public records, combed through county archives, and reviewed old meeting minutes from the HOA. It was slow, tedious work, but piece by piece, the truth began to take shape. Buried in a series of planning commission reports was a proposal for a new luxury clubhouse and recreation center, complete with expanded parking, tennis courts, and a landscaped plaza. The proposed site overlapped almost perfectly with the land where their home stood. The documents were dated months before the first violation notice had ever appeared in their mailbox. It wasn't just their property at stake. Several lots along the same street had been quietly sold over the past year, each transaction finalized under suspiciously favorable terms for the buyers. The names on the deeds didn't match the developers directly. Instead, the properties were purchased by small LLCs with vague names, all of them connected by the same registered agent. The HOA president's name appeared on multiple meeting notes that discussed facilitating acquisition of the remaining parcels. The pattern was unmistakable. The Parkers' corner lot was the last piece needed to complete the expansion. Without it, the design plans couldn't move forward. And so the campaign of fines, threats, and intimidation wasn't random, it was targeted. They weren't just unlucky homeowners caught in a strict neighborhood's rules. They were the single obstacle standing in the way of a lucrative project. Armed with this information, they thought they might finally have leverage. They contacted the HOA formally, sending a certified letter outlining what they had discovered and requesting a direct meeting to resolve the matter. The response was immediate, but not what they expected. Within days, they received 3 new violation notices in quick succession. One accused them of storing hazardous materials in their garage, another of obstructing a sidewalk with landscaping, and the third claimed they had created a safety hazard by leaving children's toys in the yard. Each came with steep fines and a stern warning that continued offenses could result in legal forfeiture of the property. It became clear that confronting the HOA directly had only escalated the situation. Soon after, their access to community amenities was revoked. Their entry fobs for the pool stopped working, and their names were removed from the tennis court reservation list. Even the neighborhood newsletter they had once received in the mail no longer arrived. The message was plain: they were being cut out entirely. Then came the lawsuit. A thick envelope arrived from a law firm representing the HOA, claiming that the Parker property posed an ongoing risk to neighborhood property values due to repeated noncompliance. The suit sought not only thousands in fines, but also a court order allowing the HOA to take possession of the home. The legal language was dense, but the intent was easy to see. This was a calculated move to break them financially and force them out. At night, the sense of surveillance grew more intense. The security cameras caught new activity. Unidentified vehicles driving slowly past, figures standing at the edge of the yard for several minutes before disappearing. One clip showed a man in a jacket with the HOA logo embroidered on the sleeve, walking along the side of the house with what appeared to be a clipboard. When the Parkers checked the timestamp, it was nearly midnight. Every day brought a new blow, and the walls felt like they were closing in. The evidence they had uncovered proved they were being targeted, but exposing it would require resources they were quickly running out of. The legal bills piled higher, and the strain began to show in every corner of their lives. The once bright and welcoming home now felt like a bunker, a place they had to defend rather than enjoy. What had started as an exciting new chapter had turned into a battle for survival, and they were beginning to realize that their enemies had no intention of backing down. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday night. The Parkers had gone to bed early, trying to rest before another week of legal stress and constant vigilance. Sometime after midnight, a sudden metallic clang echoed through the yard, jolting them awake. When they stepped outside, the garden was in ruins. The raised beds had been ripped apart, soil scattered across the grass, and the young fruit trees they had planted were snapped in half. The wooden fence on the side of the property had been smashed inward, as though hit with a heavy object. Across the garage door, thick red spray paint screamed to words, "Move out." The security cameras had captured the scene. 3 figures in dark, hooded jackets had entered the yard from the street, moving quickly and deliberately. One carried a crowbar, another a large duffel bag. In the grainy footage, a faint reflection revealed a patch on one of the jackets, an embroidered logo identical to the one used by the HOA. The faces were obscured, but the implication was undeniable. The Parkers called the police, but the response was slow and procedural. Officers took statements, collected fragments of the fence, and left with a copy of the footage. There was no promise of immediate action, only the vague assurance that it would be looked into. By morning, word had spread across the neighborhood. Some residents avoided eye contact altogether. Others watched openly as the family cleaned up the damage. The unspoken tension was suffocating. That day, they made a decision. Staying silent had gained them nothing but escalating attacks. They gathered every piece of evidence they had: violation letters, suspicious flyers, security footage, and the property documents linking the HOA to the developer, and took their story public. The first step was a detailed post online, complete with photos and video clips. Within hours, it began to spread. Local news outlets picked it up, framing it as a shocking example of HOA overreach and intimidation. By the end of the week, the footage of the midnight vandalism had gone viral, sparking outrage and drawing thousands of comments from people across the country who had their own HOA horror stories. The backlash was immediate. Investigators from the county government began looking into the HOA's operations, and journalists started digging into its financial records. The connections between the board members and the development company became impossible to deny. Patterns emerged: other homeowners who had been forced to sell, each case following the same script of escalating fines, fabricated violations, and harassment until the owner gave in. The HOA leaders denied everything, claiming the Parkers had staged the vandalism to gain sympathy. But the evidence told a different story. The late-night figure with the embroidered jacket was identified as a contracted security officer hired by the HOA bank. Records revealed payments to the same private security company during the exact period the harassment intensified. Legal charges followed. Several board members faced accusations of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of funds. The development project was halted indefinitely. But while the investigation confirmed the Parkers' suspicions and vindicated their claims, it did not undo the months of fear, stress, and financial damage they had endured. The home no longer felt safe. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every unfamiliar car parked on the street, stirred a reflex of anxiety. In the end, the family made the choice to leave Willow Ridge. They packed their belongings quietly, loading boxes into a moving truck before sunrise. Neighbors watched from their porches, some with relief, others with quiet guilt. The corner lot that had once been their dream now stood empty, the garden gone, the fence repaired, but stripped of character. They drove away without looking back. The battles they had fought would serve as a warning for others who believed that an HOA existed only to keep a community neat and orderly. Beneath the rules and regulations, they had learned, could hide a machinery of greed and control powerful enough to dismantle a family's life. And for the Parkers, no victory, legal or otherwise, could restore what had been taken from them. If you want, I can now rewrite this entire 5-chapter version in a tight, dramatic YouTube documentary script style so it reads perfectly for narration. That would make it even more gripping for viewers.